Hi, this video is linked to material from the economic video lecture of the same name and is designed to help students prepare for possible test questions and quizzes on exams based on this material. If you've not watched the lecture on this topic, you may want to do that first, so you'd find it very helpful. As a college professor, what I'm attempting to try to do here is help you, the student, prepare for quizzes and exams by reviewing real test questions that have been given on this material and items that actually come from test banks. I'll also show you how to solve some economic math problems that might be presented during the exam. Finally, I'm going to give you some advice on how to get through some of these questions quickly and also some places that get students tripped up. So let's get moving. Now, surprisingly, in the textbook that my college uses, which is one of the most popular economics textbooks out there, it seems to make the assumption that you've already learned the scientific process in another class. The book doesn't really do a very great job of explaining it, so let's do a really quick review because the material from this section of the book and the test questions tend to assume that you already know this. Now, remember that pretty much anything that we do in life is going to start with some sort of observation. The same is true with economics. The economist is going to walk along. They've gone to buy milk. Milk prices are going up. They notice that it went up last week. It went up again this week. And it's going to create them some questions. Now they're probably going to go do some research and see if they can understand what's going on. They're going to look at current data, maybe past data, and see if they can't draw some sort of a hypothesis. Now here is the interesting thing is that in economics, they don't tend to use the word hypothesis. Instead, they tend to seem to use the words like creating theories or developing possible theories. That's what I see on the test banks all the time. It is the same thing as a hypothesis, people. So just understand that it's not trying to throw you off. It's just for some reason in economics, they just don't like that word. I just don't know if they can say it. But no matter what, the next thing that we're always going to do is going to be wanting to be testing the data. But again, here is where I have to note that there's this assumption that students know what a natural experiment is, as these words, they tend to often be used in the test banks. Now, there is a slight difference between a controlled experiment that you most likely learned in your biology class and a natural experiment. Now, this type of experiment is often used in economics due to the lack of economic research that can actually be manipulating. We can't really manipulate the variables of subjects that we are exposing things to. Now, I don't think that you're going to be asked questions about natural experiments, but it is good to know what these are because so many of the test bank questions tend to use these words, and I've seen students basically get tripped up because they don't know what a naturalist experiment is, and they sometimes think that it's basically a trick question. But basically, a natural experiment is going to be when they're asking you about testing the data or doing some sort of experiment on the data. Just remember, it's a way that economists do experiments. Many of the multiple choice questions are going to be asking you about how experiments are done. And of course, after an experiment is done, they're going to talk to you about what do you do next, where you're going to analyze results, you're going to draw conclusions. And for economics, one of the big things is really reporting the results. There's all kinds of ways that we report results. They're very formal methodologies we might use. There may be formal reports we make, or it may be orally to your boss. But basically, that's the purpose of the economics research study. Questions from this area are probably going to be much more multiple choice, and what we're really doing is testing your ability to apply the scientific process to the science of economics. We'd like to know whether or not you actually understand that economists will have to use data that's already available to them. It's difficult doing an experiment in economics because economists can't manipulate the experimental variables. Economics is basically studying the real world, and it would be unethical to purposely lower the standard of living, let's say, in one society just to see what happens. We have to use the data that actually naturally occurs, thus natural experiments. I'd prepare for a question or two on the use of assumptions. The topic is pretty popular for quizzes more than it is for midterms, but tossing one or two in on a midterm, it often is sort of the easy question for a student that an instructor may pop in. And materials on models is much like assumptions. Popular on quizzes, not so much on midterms. This is because by midterm, you're well into modeling, and basically if you don't know this information, you're not going to be modeling well. Now what you see here is what I've posted is generally the most popular multiple choice topics or question topics for this particular group of material. I would definitely prepare for questions on the circular flow models for both quizzes and midterms. It's a basic model that you see popping in right now that most economics theories are built off of. Your instructor will want to make sure you know it. So know it, love it, become one with it. But I also want to remind you that, this is basically just a simple model. But its strength is that it shows basically the entire economy's interactions with the two main decision makers, firms and households, in one simple model. Its weakness is that it doesn't include or explain how transactions occur in the households between firms. Think like it doesn't talk about cash or credit or internet or anything like that. It's a very simple model. Now, I would make sure that you remember it has two loops. That the outer loop shows wages, incomes, rent, spending, revenue, things like that. And the inner loop is all about inputs and outputs into the system, such as land, where selling and buying occurs of the goods and services in the marketplace, and capital items. Now, I'd also expect to see questions that actually talk about how the interactions occur as far as the flow, such as income that flows from the firm, to the household, but it flows through the factors of production. So what types of items flow from the firm through the factors of production to the households? Well, wages and income. Now, rent, you could say, because the firm pays the wages and the wages are used to pay rent. And profit would also go the same direction because firms take the profit through the factors of production, and they go to households. If it's a household that owns any kind of stock, then you're an owner and you get profit. Now, the factors of production, these inputs you might want to say, they almost always are the same three: labor, land, and capital. So if you get a question on that, it's labor, land, and capital. Just be careful about capital. Capital in this model is not money, but rather buildings and machines needed for production. Money is used to buy capital items, and I like to use the word capital items in this case. Sometimes a student gets confused by the word capital and thinks raising capital, so raising money. But we're really talking about capital items, the items that are bought to produce. So a grill in a restaurant would be a capital item, not the stock in the restaurant. Now, the other thing is that I do tend to see the word output used interchangeably with goods and services in questions. This is because the output of a firm are the goods or services that a firm produces. So the firm moves outputs to the markets. They move their goods and services to the market. Same thing. Don't let it confuse you. The other thing that you may see test questions on is basically things about, how the flow is interrupted. And meaning is that if a factory burns down, what would be interrupted? Well, the factors of production would be interrupted. If the economy goes down, what would be interrupted? Perhaps the buying of items from the market to the households. So again, it's about the flow. In reality, you're not going to get to see my pretty little display up there of the diagram. Instead, you're going to see probably one of these black and white. These three are taken directly from the test banks for this particular material, and you can see that they have lots of A's and B's and lines and C's. And so what you're going to do is you're going to find that you get some multiple choice questions that show you this blank model, one of these three images, and then they'll ask you questions like which arrow represents the flow of goods, or what does box A represent, or what does the flow from rectangle B to oval B represent. Now you can see these are just blank versions of the model. I would strongly recommend that, depending on your instructor's testing methods, if you're allowed, as soon as you sit down for your exam, that you get a scrap sheet of paper out, and as quickly as you can, you draw the model, the one that's up there in the corner. Draw it out, label it really fast, whatever little labels you want to do. I tend to just use the letter L or I just so I'd remember what it was. In fact, I would do that for all the models that you might be tested for this exam. You want to do it while it's fresh in your head and before basically you get confused with other questions. In fact, if you have a moment, I might pause this video and see if you can't label these particular boxes that you have right now. And yes, you'll notice I erased my little model in the corner. No peeking. For exams, like the circular flow model, I'd be ready for questions on your basic knowledge of this diagram that's popping in over there in the corner. Remember, this is the possibility frontier, or what they often is referred to as the PPF. Remember, this diagram is about how much can be made by a society. It shows the possible outcomes assuming a simple factors such as the society can only make 2 items. Now, I also should warn you that basically the green area is called the production possibility frontier on exams. They're not going to call it the green area. I call it that to make it a little bit easier for students to understand the concepts. But exams are always using formal definitions, formal words. Although I have seen some of the multiple choice questions in test banks use things like under the curve. Basically, it's the same thing. Remember, the black line is the area where they are the most efficient. If it's in the green, this is an inefficient area. There's some unused production. Anything outside the black line is no production. It's outside the curve. You can't produce there because you don't have enough resources. So if you have a test question asking what number D is, or what number C is showing, or what number A is, you're going to want to make sure that you understand D is inefficient, that A is efficient, and C is impossible. You'll also want to be able to identify the numbers that go with each one, but I'll go into one of those examples a little bit in more detail in a couple of slides. They also sometimes I see multiple choice questions in the test banks that ask you about applying the principles from the first lecture, the first 10 principles you might say of economics, to this particular model. So this one is really showing trade-offs, principle 1, and that's because in order for you to produce more items, you're going to have to trade off making less of something else. So again, go back to my lecture and I go through that in a little bit more detail. There's the other thing is that they sometimes ask you about the bow. Why is this not a straight line? The bow is all about opportunity cost, which is also principle 2. The cost isn't always equivalent from one item that you're producing to another. So in my Waka Waka experiment, we're making computers on one side and we're making movies on the other. Things that you use to make computers may not be as adaptable to making movies, and vice versa. And finally, the other question they quite often ask is, what is this model focusing on? It is focusing on efficiency, not equality. That's one that we tend to forget is a principle that they talk a lot about, efficiency versus equality, which is also related back to principle 1. So these are the type of multiple choice questions that you'll see about this particular chart. I'll talk a little bit more about what I call solutions, because you'll be given problems that are going to ask you to calculate or to come up with some solutions, or basically analysis of what you're seeing from the charts in just a few slides. I want to review this one because I see this type of question in multiple chapters being presented to you, where you're given a little data box and there's a missing number and you have to figure out what the missing number is. Most of the time you're going to solve these about the same way. Now in this case, we're looking for is what is the PPF, basically what number should be on their line. And notice that I have 2 different ways to do this. One might be, what is it, the missing number if it's a straight line, or what is the missing number if it's bowed. Now this is pretty important to look for. Those are the 2 keywords because they will be different numbers. So we're going to start with the straight line, because no matter what, if you're solving the one that's bowed, you're going to have to solve the straight line first. So we're talking about is what straight line would be on here. You'd have to know that before you would know what the bowed line was. But it's really super simple, because that straight line means that we have a slope that is even. And to have even slopes, you have to have even differences between your numbers. So this one's really simple because the differences between each one of these numbers is 3. which means you also have to have even distances between the numbers on the other side. So we have to have an even distance between these. And pretty simple to find out. We just take 900 from 300, and the answer is 600. So 600 is going to be our missing number for a straight line. But we want to double check ourselves. So we simply divide that by 2 because we have 2 spots, 1, 2, and it should be evenly distributed. And if we put our little brackets up, sure enough, it's 300 and 300. 2 300s makes a 600. So we know we've got the right answer for a straight line. And I keep saying that because remember, the bowed line is going to be slightly different. So let's look at the choices that they give us. They're the choices we've gotten. But notice I did solve this before I gave you choices. And that's one of the biggest hints I have. Solve what that number should be for the straight line before you even look at what the choices are. Because the choices are generally there to try to throw you off. But if you know what the number should be, you're just looking for which letter is the right number. But again, I'm one of those people who likes to just double, maybe even triple check myself sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and plot these numbers out. I'm willing to spend, $1 down at the dollar store to buy some cheap graph paper, or I'll even just draw one out on my scrap paper really fast. So what we do have is 2 coordinate points that we know are for sure. This coordinate point and this coordinate point were given to us in the problem. So we can graph those 2 in our little chart. We want to draw a straight line because we're being asked for the straight line. And I said you have to solve this one first before you can solve the other one. So now all we're going to do is check whether or not the 6 and the 600 would fall on that straight line. And if we plot it, sure enough, it falls on the straight line. So that's the point that would be on the straight line. Now, the second question that's asked is, what if it's bowed? So that's going to be a little bit different. One thing we know for sure is that it's going to be 6 surfboards. So if we know that for sure, what I would always do, or what I tend to do, is draw myself a little arrow from 6. I know that this number has to be on the 6. I also know that the number has to be beyond 600. So if we look at 400, that's not going to make a bowed line, is it? And 450 isn't going to make us a bowed line. But 750 goes beyond, and that will create a bowed line. So if my points were this 900, and I draw it through here, I'm drawing this by myself, which is not always so good, and through here, we've got a bow. So we know the answer for a bowed line would have to be 750 from these choices. Actually, for a bowed line, it would be anything beyond this point going up. So 601 would make a bowed line, 602. So anything above that would make a bowed line. So as you see, not so hard to solve. Get used to doing it though, because you're probably going to see quite a few problems that are going to have you starting with figuring out what a straight line is, and then figuring out shifts, figuring out curves, figuring out all kinds of things from that. Let's move on to the next one though. Here's another one I see all the time being used. I'll be honest, even I've used this one several times. And basically what we do is we give you a little chart like this, maybe a little longer. This is just a little short to make it fit on the slide. And we've given you footballs versus basketballs in this case. If I make footballs, how many basketballs could I make? So just kind of always remember that if I'm making 600 footballs, then in this case I'm making 0 basketballs. Very important that you get that correct in your head before you move forward. So I might ask you a question like this. What is the opportunity cost of going from making 200 footballs to making 400 footballs? So going up to here. Well, what we're going to see is that there's going to be a change in the amount of basketballs that are being made. In this case, we're going to be making less basketballs. So the opportunity cost is basically the loss of the basketballs, because we're going to lose the opportunity to get whatever income or revenue we might get from that. So it's a pretty simple thing. It is going to be 350. Now, what I'm going to tell you though is that on the test, they're going to give you 800 and 450 as one of your potential choices. Why? Because they're looking to see if a student understands it is the difference between these two numbers that you're looking for, not these two numbers at all. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of students would pick 450 because they see that as the number. Remember, it is the difference between these because you're making that much less. when you get up to 400? So that's a pretty common question that might be asked. Another one is something like this, where you're given a group of statements and you have to decide which one is based true on the chart. So I'll give you a moment to sort of read through these and see if you can decide which one would be most likely correct. Well, the answer is C. Now, if you didn't get C, the question might be in your head, well, how can C be right? Well, remember, we are looking for the opportunity cost for the additional 200 footballs. So we're starting with 0 and we move to making 200 footballs. The opportunity cost is going to be the difference between these two numbers. And then what's the opportunity cost between 2 to 400? Again, it's going to be this. Now, we already know what that is. That's going to be 350. Because we figured it out in the problem before. And what's the opportunity cost of going from 400 to 600? And again, it's going to be the number that floats in there. So if we get those numbers, we can see it's going to be basically progressing a little bit bigger each time. The first time we lose 200. The next time the opportunity cost is going to be 350. And the next 200 is going to be 450. So it goes up. Now what I'm trying to show you is that taking the 2 seconds to write down the numbers, physically write them down in between, will help you make sure that you're looking at all the possible answers. Because the truth is that the thing that we're looking for generally in a chart like this are those opportunity costs. You know, what are the numbers between the numbers? Now we don't give those to you. That's for you to figure out. So those are usually the biggest things. And finally, what I have to say is that most of the time when I see students get this question wrong in my classroom, it's because not that they didn't understand the concept, but literally they looked at the wrong numbers. I can't stress this enough. Use a piece of paper, use your finger, double check yourself on your numbers, because if you write down the wrong numbers or you're looking at the wrong numbers, you're going to get the wrong answer. Literally, when I was making this slide, my eyes slid from one number to another on the chart, and I caught myself and I had to go back and fix it. It's so easy to do, especially when you're under stress. So again, if you have a little extra time at the end of your test, go back and double check that you're using the correct numbers and that you're figuring the correct thing. So opportunity costs, they're asking about opportunity costs. It's always going to be about the numbers in between, not the numbers that you actually see on the chart. It's about that change, that thing that you're giving up in order to get something else. Now, I showed these diagrams before, but my diagram was a pretty little diagram. These are actually samples of diagrams that come with multiple choice questions from a test bank. So these are more likely the diagrams you're going to see. So looking at diagram 1, the kind of questions you might see based on this diagram is, you know, what does T represent? And of course, hopefully you would know that T is inefficiency. They're not using all their productivity that's available. And what does S represent? S would represent an inability to produce at that point. It's outside the arch. They can't get there. Now, one of the ones that's a little bit different in this particular question, you might want to say than others, is the letter Q. Now, we haven't talked about that point very much, and you know, sometimes it actually shows up on the test questions, and I'm always kind of surprised because, well, we haven't talked about it much. What Q represents is basically an increase in the production of windows. Now, there's a couple of ways they could ask this. If they were just to ask you, what does Q represent? Right now, Q represents a amount of windows that are not able to be made because they're outside the arch. But look at the question carefully. It may say what would need to be done for the society to be able to reach to Q, which, so if they're asking you what it would make to make it reach Q, what they're basically saying is, what do they have to do to this arch to make it come up here? And that would have to be a growth in the economy. A growth in the economy might be an increase in productivity, meaning is that they're able to produce more with the same amount of labor that they have, or they have to somehow find an increase in technology, or they need an increase in resources. Something has to change basically for this arch to move up there. So there's two kind of questions again that might be asked for this Q1. It may be, you know, can they produce at that level? And the answer would be no. Or what would they have to do to reach to that level? Or they may give you a chart that has two lines on it and asks you why is it that there's a difference in the two lines. Because something has changed. Now, I can't tell you what's changed. You'd have to look at the scenario. The other one that's kind of common to give you is, what does you tell us? Well, remember down here, this line is about doors. And if we're way down here, that means that all the resources in this particular society are being used to create doors. They're not actually making any windows. Now, it is very efficient because it is on the line, but it's only if they're using all their efficiency to produce doors, no windows at all. So then what is R telling us? Well, R is telling us that they're making more windows than they're making doors in their society, and they are being efficient. Now, how do we know this? Because you can see these little lines I'm drawing right here. If you'll notice that the line for windows crosses much higher on the rise. So if we imagine numbers here, and I'm getting better at writing them with my little mouse, you can see that, reaches maybe the number 5. Where over here, if we're writing sort of the same numbers down here, we're looking at making doors at maybe 1.5. So we're making far more windows than we are making doors, but we also are being pretty efficient about it because, again, we're on the efficiency line. Now, the other thing they could ask you in these type of questions is what is happening that could move something from the letter U to the letter R? And in that case, there's some sort of change in policy. There could be a change in resources that are available, but there's been some sort of change as far as decisions of what that society will make. The one that I see more often, though, is this diagram number 2. And I got rid of that other one just so that we have some room again to write some things. Now, diagram number 2 is basically going to be different because we've got numbers, and numbers like to, I don't know, be confusing when you're in the middle of a test and you're stressed and you're hungry and you think you don't know anything, but you actually really need to know a lot of things. Also, when you see a chart like this, you see several questions generally related to that diagram. So let's take a dive in and take a quick look. First of all, we want to make sure we understand what each point is. We already know what D is. We know what C is. Those aren't any different than before. We know what A and B is basically showing us, but we might want to get a little bit more detailed on what A is showing us. We want to make sure that we understand that A is basically falling here at the 60 line for dryers, and that dot is also saying we're making 50 washers. Now, why is this important? Because if you don't have those basic numbers right in the first place, then anything they may ask you to calculate after that, you might calculate incorrectly. Now, a hint that I will tell you to do, and I tell my students to do, is one of the first things when I see a chart like this, is I write things like this out there. I might write, 60D and 50 Ws. Now, of course, I can write this nicer when I'm using a pen or pencil. I mean, I literally write it right next to the dot so that I can remember where I'm at. So then I might write the same thing for B as far as where it is. And we know with B, it's 40 dryers and 70 washers. Because again, we can throw our lines out there and see where we're going. It's just a good little hint if you've got a moment to do that to make sure that you're not messing your numbers up. Again, what I usually see students making mistakes on. We know the slope is downward, so there's got to be a negative number, and that the most dryers that they could make would be 80, because that's a question that I might ask. What is the most dryers that the society could make? Or I might ask you, what is the most amount of washers that a dryer that they could make? Now, this one, yeah, I've seen students actually get messed up on that one because there are no numbers here, but you should notice that it goes in tens, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And we know it because that's where the crossing point is. So don't let a little thing like that mess you up, but you'd be surprised in the middle of a test and a little anxiety and a desire for a Snickers bar, you suddenly forget that. Asking to move from point A to point B. Here they're asking you for an opportunity cost. And remember, it's all about change. So from A to B, this arch right here, what we're really doing is we're going down, aren't we? And so we're going from 60 to 40. Whereas if we were talking about moving from point B to point A, we're talking about moving, oh, I got the wrong thing. We're talking about moving on the run here. And so we'd be moving from 50 to 70, which happens to be the same amount. And again, we like easy numbers here in economics, but that can also be a little confusing to students when they see the exact same number. If we're out talking about moving from D to A, now something has increased because we're inefficient here, and so we've had some sort of an efficiency that's come in, or the economy's picked up, or unemployment's picked up. But here's one of the things to notice about any of these questions. We have to look at where D is. D is on the 50 mark and the 40 mark. So they're making 40 dryers and 50 washers. When we talk about moving from one point to the other, so from D to A, we're not going to be changing washers. It's going to be the same amount. What will change is the amount of dryers. And the same would happen if we're going from D to B. We would see a change in one and not a change in the other. So we would have an opportunity cost that is different in this case. By the way, you could be asked about the reverse, which is what would happen if we are reversing from B to D. And basically, we would have to have some sort of a decrease in productivity, some sort of decrease in efficiency. Something has happened to our economy, and we're not able to produce at the same levels. So we have a loss of production. And finally, you have to remember, anytime they ask you about anything outside the arch, it cannot be done. In this case, there is no Q. So remember in the last one, we had a little Q up here. Well, there is no Q in this one, so they're not going to be asking you about what would happen if we could move up to this. In this case, they're strictly going to be talking about point number C. Don't get sucked in to anything about change up to here. It can't happen. Nothing can happen here. It may feel weird to pick an answer that says, ain't gonna occur, buddy, but basically that's what we're talking about. I would expect to see several questions if you get a chart like this. And the diagram really isn't that hard as long as you take a moment to just sort of label things and make sure you know which direction you're going. Notice I literally drew arrows for myself to make sure I was remembering which direction we were talking about. It really is very helpful for you as you move through this question. Now, when we talk about economists as policy advisors, really this section is sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say it's a fill in the blank type of thing. What I have seen is some questions on this that are short answers. And really what they're trying to do is get you to understand that there are positive and normative statements. And the positive statements are basically used to make absolute statements of fact and only fact. And we're speaking like a scientist, whereas these normative statements, those are more about how an economy should be. And they're more opinion based. And so generally what I see is a question that gives you a statement and it asks you is it positive or normative, or it may say which statement below is a positive or normative statement. So you're looking for which one is basically an opinion and which one is speaking to facts. That's the only trick with these questions. If you've listened to my lectures, you'll see I didn't cover this material. Generally, to be honest, in my classes, I don't cover this because my students have already covered this material in another class. They have to come into this class, my economics classes, knowing this material. However, I've added this note page for those who have economics classes where this material is being covered. Generally, it's covered in the discussion about economics as policy advisors, generally early on in economics courses. These will tend to be multiple choice questions on this material, and it's generally pretty straightforward, such as what do an economist in the Treasury Department do? Or what type of advisors would generally give advice to the president on taxes? To be honest, I'm not certain what else I can do to help you with this material. It's basically a memorize and regurgitate type of item. But do look to see how much emphasis your instructor gives on this material. Many professors believe this is vital material for the real-world application of economics as you move through a course. And I do believe in that. It's just, again, as I said, this material tends to be covered in my other courses. And so my students already know this coming in, so it's not usually part of the lecture that I give. That covers all the material for this lecture on Thinking Like an Economist. There is going to be a supporting video you could check out for graphing that, many students need a quick review on that. It's going to cover things such as curves in coordinate systems, calculating slopes, determining cause and effect. So if you saw that you had any little trouble with some of those problems that we talked about, you might want to check out that. As always, it's always best to refer back to your course material and professor's instructions about what material will be covered on your specific quizzes, exams, and homework. They are the experts, after all, on what you need to know to pass their course. Till next time, keep learning.